Defending his draft, Bulganin tried to substantiate it with the fact that Stalin, the People's Commissar for Defense, was overloaded with party and state work. "That is not a valid reason," I said to Bulganin, seeking to reject his arguments. "Today the People's Commissar is Stalin. Tomorrow it might be somebody else. The laws are written not for one particular person, but for the specific post." Bulganin relayed this to Stalin in a distorted fashion, adding, "Zhukov is a marshal of the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to deal with me, a mere general." Bulganin's move was calculated so that Stalin would give him the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union. Indeed, within a day, there was a decree published assigning the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union to Bulganin, and Stalin told me that the position in regard to the Defense Commissariat should be worked on some more. It was clear to me that Bulganin had become Stalin's right-hand man in relation to the People's Commissariat of Defense. Bulganin's knowledge of military affairs was very poor, and he didn't have a clue about operational and strategic issues. But an intuitively developed person, also cunning, he managed to get near Stalin and gain his trust. Of course, Stalin realized that he, Bulganin, was not a great find for the armed forces, but he needed him as a smart diplomat and an unquestioning idolater. Stalin knew that Bulganin would do anything for him. Passing the post of Chief of the Occupation Forces to my deputy V.D. Sokolovsky, I arrived in Moscow and accepted the post of Chief of the Ground Forces. During this period, the demobilization from the army and fleet of older soldiers was being completed. Military life and conflict with Stalin. Military life was not yet back to normal. Military order and service were not at the proper level. To bring the army to its normal state, we designed a set of educational measures for the ground forces and prepared a draft decree regarding combat training for 1946. The draft decree was sent to Stalin and copied to Bulganin. Stalin, heeding Bulganin's whispers, viewed my actions as separatism, as if I was ignoring him. There was a major and unpleasant discussion about the content of the draft decree, especially regarding the involvement of reserve troops and units of the High Command in joint field and command staff exercises of the ground forces. Bulganin stated, "Zhukov wants to take all the reserves of the High Command under his power, leaving us empty-handed." I dismissed this as childish talk, but my reply did not sit well with Stalin. It was suggested that I rework the draft decree. I revised it, but again Stalin did not authorize it. Vasilevsky confided that Stalin wants to issue a Defense Commissariat decree, not a High Command decree. They then took my draft and reworked it into a Commissariat decree, which was signed by Stalin immediately. It turned out even better. I realized I was wrong to insist on a command decree rather than a commissariat decree. As time passed, the tensions in my relations with Bulganin and Stalin grew. I felt there was some underhanded work being done around me. Eventually, major trouble erupted. Stalin convened the main military council, inviting all members of the Politburo, marshals and generals, including F.I. Golikov and A.V. Krylev. Stalin entered the meeting hall as gloomy as a dark cloud. Without uttering a word, he pulled a paper from his pocket, threw it to the secretary of the main military council, General S.M. Shtimenko, and said, "Read." Shtimenko approached the tribunal and began reading a statement about Zhukov from my former adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Simochkin, and Chief Marshal of Aviation A.A. Novikov, who were imprisoned after being arrested by the state security organs. The statement filled several sheets, alleging that Marshal Zhukov was disloyal to Stalin, considered himself the main leader in the war, and conducted conversations against Stalin. It was claimed that during the war I had gathered a group of disgruntled generals and officers around me. After the reading, Stalin invited speeches. Molotov, Beria, and Bulganin criticized me for not being grateful to Stalin for his good treatment, for putting on airs, and for disregarding the authority of the Politburo and Stalin himself, stating that I needed to be put in my place. General Golikov echoed these sentiments, alleging that I had no justification for removing him from his post as front commander due to the failure of his front's actions at Kharkov in 1943. However, the majority of the present generals supported me. Marshal of Armored Forces P.S. Rybalko especially spoke in my favour, highlighting how I had assisted troops in making crucial decisions and crushing the enemy during difficult circumstances. Ultimately, I was removed from my position as Chief of the Ground Forces and reassigned to command the troops of the Odessa military region. At the next Central Committee plenum, I was removed from membership of the CC without formal explanation, though A.A. Zhdanov remarked that Zhukov is too young and not mature enough for the CC. In 1947, a large group of generals and officers, mainly those who had worked with me, were arrested. Among those arrested were Generals Minuk, Filatov, Varenikov, and Krukov, along with ex-member of the Military Council of the First Belarusian Front K.F. Telegin and others. They were physically coerced into confessing to a military plot against Stalin's leadership, supposedly organized by me. This affair was led by Abakumov and Beria, whose efforts were focused on securing my arrest. However, Stalin did not believe I was attempting to organize a military plot and refused to authorize my arrest. Khrushchev later told me that Stalin said to Beria, "I don't believe that Zhukov would do such a thing. I know him well. He is straightforward, harsh, and capable of telling you something unpleasant to your face, but he wouldn't go against the Central Committee." Thus, Stalin did not allow my arrest, and when Abakumov himself was arrested, it was revealed that he had fabricated the charges against me, reminiscent of the dark years of 1937-1939. Abakumov was executed, and at the 19th Party Congress, Stalin personally recommended me for membership in the Central Committee. Throughout this unfavourable period, Stalin never spoke ill of me, for which I was grateful. After the death of Stalin, it was March 1953. I had just returned to Sverdlovsk from tactical exercises with the district's troops when the chief of my secretariat reported that Minister of Defence Bulganin had called on the secure line and ordered me to phone him back. I did so immediately. Bulganin informed me, "Tomorrow morning you must be in Moscow." I attempted to clarify the reason for the summons, but Bulganin replied, "Fly in and you will find out." In recent years I had rarely been summoned to Moscow for anything pleasant, so I pondered this invitation for a long time, but reached no definite conclusions. We flew from Sverdlovsk to Moscow in 4 hours. The weather was clear, and I looked at the winter landscape from above with great interest. We landed at the central city aerodrome, where I was met by officers from Bulganin's secretariat, who instructed me to go straight to the Minister of Defence. I wondered why there was such urgency. I found Bulganin in his office, still wearing his greatcoat and speaking on the Kremlin line. I introduced myself in military fashion, and Bulganin informed me, "A plenum of the Central Committee, CC, is going to take place today. You need to be present. I am in a hurry to get to the Kremlin." He shook my hand and briskly left his office for his car. After a quick meal, I went to see Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff. After discussing current work, I asked him if he knew what would be on the agenda for the CC plenum. He replied, "I swear I don't know. The Minister of Defence just called me and said there would be a plenum today. The time of the meeting will be announced later." As we gathered for the plenum in the lobby, we learned that Stalin was seriously ill. At the appointed hour, the participants took their seats in the Sverdlov Hall. In 15-20 minutes, the Presidium appeared. Opening the plenum, Khrushchev said, "This plenum has been called because of the serious illness of Comrade Stalin. Due to his health condition, he will most likely not be back soon to lead the party and the state. The Presidium presents for your consideration a set of pressing issues regarding the improvement of the structure of ministries, central state departments, and personnel appointments." Khrushchev was proposed as the first secretary of the CC, Malenkov as the chairman of the Council of Ministers. The Ministry of Internal Affairs was to be merged with the Ministry of State Security, and Beria was named Minister of Internal Affairs. My candidacy for First Deputy Minister of Defence was considered and confirmed. This appointment surprised me, as Bulganin was not a figure of authority for me, and he was aware of this. I was later told that Bulganin opposed my appointment, stating it would be difficult for him to work with Zhukov, as he did not recognize him as a military man. Nonetheless, I was informed that state interests required my assignment as First Deputy Minister of Defense, and any personal relations would have to be managed by Bulganin. Since I hadn't returned to Sverdlovsk, I took on my new responsibilities immediately. Before beginning my role as First Deputy Minister of Defense, I had a serious conversation with Bulganin. He started by saying that although, in the past, not everything was smooth between us, he was not to blame. He insisted we draw a line under the past and start anew on a healthy, friendly basis for the sake of state defense. It was as if he had been the first to propose my candidacy. I told Bulganin, "Nikolai Alexandrovich, you did many unpleasant things to me, placing me in harm's way under Stalin, but in the interests of the state, I would like to forget that. If you sincerely want to work together on a friendly basis, let's leave the past behind." When Khrushchev reported to the plenum the Presidium's proposals to simplify state governance and the candidates for leading state posts, it appeared that Stalin was no longer a living person and would never again rule the party and the state. At the end of the plenum, a bulletin was issued regarding Stalin's health, clearly indicating that he was still unconscious and living out his last days. Observing the faces of the Presidium members, I concluded that their attitudes towards Stalin varied. Molotov appeared pensive and visibly anxious, worried about the situation. Voroshilov seemed at a loss. It was hard to determine if he was anxious, sad, or indifferent. He often acted this way under Stalin, perhaps still hoping that Stalin's death was not inevitable. Malenkov, Khrushchev, Beria and Bulganin seemed in high spirits, seemingly aware that Stalin would soon die. Their critiques of the state order under Stalin indicated they felt free to voice their opinions, unlike during Stalin's time. Beria, sitting next to Bulganin, tried to maintain a friendly demeanor, but his eyes, hidden behind glasses, betrayed his cunning and cold cruelty. His whole demeanor suggested, "Enough of the Stalinist order. We suffered under him. Now everything will be different." I knew Beria well. I had witnessed his subservience to Stalin and his willingness to remove anyone who displeased him. It was repulsive to witness his masquerade as a true Bolshevik Leninist. Bulganin, as usual, was the epitome of subservience, approaching one person after another, smiling sweetly and offering firm handshakes. He frequently chimed in with affirmations to Khrushchev, saying, "That's right, Nikita Sergeyevich, that's right. It should have been done long ago." The remaining members of the Presidium remained silent, as they had during Stalin's time. A mournful mood prevailed among most CC members and candidates, with many sincerely saddened by Stalin's near-death condition. It was inevitable, as Stalin had been the universally acknowledged authority and leader. The party valued his achievements and trusted him. At that time, no one knew about the extent of the evil inflicted on the Soviet people by Stalin during the years 1937-38. Despite Stalin's unfairness to me after the Great Patriotic War, I sincerely felt sorry for him and valued him for the immense work he had accomplished after Lenin and during the war. During Stalin's funeral, Bulganin recounted to me how misfortune had struck Stalin the previous night. In the evening, he, Khrushchev, Beria and Malenkov, who Bulganin always referred to as three inseparable friends, had gathered at Stalin's dacha. After talking about business, everybody sat down at the table for dinner. Stalin was in a good mood and joked a lot. The dinner, as often happened at Stalin's place, continued until 2 a.m. Bulganin and Malenkov departed at 2 a.m., and it seems that Beria and Khrushchev left around 3 a.m. 15 to 20 minutes after Beria's and Khrushchev's departure, General Vlasic entered Stalin's dining room to help him to bed and saw Stalin lying on the floor in a semi-conscious state. Vlasic immediately called Beria and the doctors. Apparently, Vlasic and his security team carried Stalin to bed. The doctors arrived, and in the presence of Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev, they tried to help Stalin, but it was in vain. Stalin was unconscious and deemed paralyzed. A bit later, Bulganin and other members of the Presidium arrived. It was decided that a member of the Presidium and specialists from the Kremlin clinic would be on duty at all times. A short time later, Stalin died without regaining consciousness. After Stalin's funeral, the Soviet people sincerely mourned his death and placed all their hopes in the party, which in previous years had led them confidently on the path toward communism. Soon I was inducted into the CC Presidium and had a good opportunity to get to know the post-Stalin method and the style of the work of the party's highest organs. As a rule, under Stalin, the Presidium examined only really important issues. Discussions were very short, and essential proposals were only tabled. Less important issues were dealt with and decided by the CCC Secretariat or by commissions formed by the Presidium. After Stalin's death, 25 to 30 matters were examined at each meeting of the Presidium, more than half of which were not particularly important and could easily have been decided by the ministries. Due to the extraordinary overload of the meeting agendas, it was not possible to discuss in detail even those issues of significance to the state. It was a paradoxical situation. The substance of an issue was not investigated deeply. Because they were unable to probe deeply into all 25 to 30 questions, the members of the Presidium simply declined or accepted proposals, essentially rubber-stamping the recommendations of their apparatus, aides, and consultants. After a while, it was concluded that it was necessary to relieve the Presidium of many secondary issues, obliging the ministries and Gosplan, the state economic planning organization, to resolve their own issues. However, fearing what might happen, ministries were unwilling to decide issues for themselves and continued to bombard the Presidium with questions. This was an effect of the habit inculcated during Stalin's time: never decide anything without the Central Committee's sanction. Initially, after Stalin's death, there existed an especially firm friendship between Khrushchev, Beria, and Malenkov. In the Presidium and in the life of the whole country, these three men played a decisive role. Bulganin grovelled in front of them. He told me several times, "Before putting a defence ministry matter to the Presidium, it was necessary to elicit the views and agreement of Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Beria, and then the other members of the Presidium would vote in favour unreservedly." In order to toady to Beria, Bulganin followed Beria's recommendation and disbanded the Teska army football team, sending the best players to Dynamo, that is, to the team of the MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs. The Soviet army was left with no football team for a long time. Molotov remained aloof, while Voroshilov, it can be said, did not play any role. I can't recall any occasion when Voroshilov made an active proposal. Material sent to him remained unread, and he almost never prepared for meetings. The main and leading role was played by Khrushchev, supported in every possible way by Beria and Malenkov when he was still chairman of the Council of Ministers, not to mention Bulganin. Then some very important things happened. Beria was arrested. It happened like this. Bulganin rang me and said, "Come quickly, please, to me for a minute. I'm in a rush to the Kremlin." I sped down from the 4th floor to the 2nd and entered Bulganin's office. He told me, "Call Moskalenko, Nedolin, Batitsky, and a couple more whom you consider necessary, and go with them to Malenkov's office immediately." In 30 minutes, I and a group of generals were in the reception of Malenkov's office. I was summoned into the office immediately, where besides Malenkov there were Molotov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin. Having greeted me, Malenkov said, "We called you to give you a very important assignment. Lately Beria has been carrying out suspicious activities amongst his people, directed against members of the Presidium. We think that Beria has become a dangerous person for the party and the state. We have decided to arrest him and to neutralize the NKVD. We have decided to entrust the arrest of Beria to you personally." Khrushchev added, "We have no doubt that you will be able to do this very well, particularly since Beria has brought you personally a lot of unpleasant troubles. Do you have any doubts about this?" I replied, "What doubts could there be? The assignment will be executed." Khrushchev warned, "Keep in mind that Beria is crafty and is physically quite a strong man, the more so since it seems he is armed." I said, "Of course I am not a specialist in arrests, and I haven't had to do that, but my hand won't shake. Just say where and when he should be arrested." Malenkov explained, We have called Beria to a meeting of the Council of Ministers, but instead of a council meeting, there will be a presidium meeting, at which Beria will be accused, among other things, of ignoring the CC, of displaying a disloyal attitude to presidium members, and of appointing leaders of the NKVD without the CC's agreement. During the meeting, you should be in the recreation room and wait for 2 rings. After the 2 rings, you will enter the office and arrest Beria. Is everything clear? I replied, completely. Beria arrived, and the meeting commenced. The meeting lasted for 1 hour and then another, but the bell did not ring as agreed. I began to worry that Beria had arrested those who wanted to arrest him. Then the bell rang. Leaving 2 military officers at the door of Malenkov's office, we went in. As agreed, the generals took out their pistols, and I quickly approached Beria and said loudly, "Beria, stand up, you are under arrest," simultaneously grabbing both his hands, lifting him off the chair and briskly feeling his pockets. There was no weapon. His briefcase was immediately thrown onto the table. Beria became horribly pale and started to mumble something. 2 generals took him by the arms and led him to the back room of Malenkov's office, where a thorough search was performed and any not permitted objects were removed. At 11 p.m., Beria was secretly moved from the Kremlin to the military prison, and 24 hours later he was transferred to the command post of the Moscow military district, where he was entrusted to the security of the same group that had arrested him. Thereafter, I did not participate in either the guarding or the prosecution process. After his trial, Beria was shot by the same people who had guarded him. During the execution, Beria behaved very badly, like the worst coward. He cried hysterically, dropped to his knees, and then soiled himself. In a word, he lived an unsavoury life and died an even nastier death. After Beria's execution, the Presidium worked in a friendly fashion for some time, but then serious disagreements and arguments arose, descending into personal insults, especially between Khrushchev, Kaganovich, and Molotov. It has to be said that old scores were being settled between Kaganovich and Khrushchev. Hostile relations had their origins in when they worked together in the Moscow committee of the party, as well as when Kaganovich was party leader in Ukraine and Khrushchev served under him. Kaganovich considered himself the more educated Marxist-Leninist, but Khrushchev didn't recognize this quality in Kaganovich and viewed him as an incorrigible, dogmatic Stalinist. When the 20th Party Congress was being prepared, Khrushchev raised the need to address the issue of Stalin's personality cult. Molotov, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, and Malenkov spoke out against raising the question of Stalin's personality cult. The rest, especially the younger members of the Presidium, supported Khrushchev. Molotov, Kaganovich, and Voroshilov were particularly ardent and hardline in their opposition to this issue. Together with Stalin, they had indiscriminately annihilated party, Soviet, and military cadres during the dark years of 1937-38. They opposed the discussion because they feared exposure alongside Stalin, anticipating that the Congress would demand they be held severely accountable. After the 20th Party Congress and the removal of Malenkov as chairman of the Council of Ministers, mutual relations within the Presidium became even more strained. Malenkov distanced himself from Khrushchev and grew closer to Kaganovich and Molotov. Malenkov's personal resentment was evident, rather than a principled point of view. Bulganin was appointed chairman of the Council of Ministers in place of Malenkov, and I became Minister of Defence. I can't recall one meeting of the Presidium without a fight or argument between Khrushchev and Kaganovich, or between Khrushchev and Molotov. To us, the new members of the Presidium, such hostile relations among the old members, some of whom had worked together with Stalin and even Lenin, seemed strange. Such disloyal attitudes toward each other could only have an impact. There were unprincipled arguments, and the issues they related to remained unresolved. We tried to advise them to cease their abuse, but our voices lacked authority. Personally, I thought Khrushchev's direction was more correct than that of Kaganovich and Molotov, who clung tightly to old dogmas and were unwilling to change in accordance with the spirit of the times. It seemed to me that Khrushchev was always considering and trying to find more progressive methods, means, and ways to build socialism and develop the economy and general life of the country. I got to know Khrushchev well in Ukraine in 1940, during the years of the Great Patriotic War and in the post-war period. I considered him a good man, consistently genial, and, undoubtedly, an optimist. Stalin regarded Khrushchev, but I noticed that he was sometimes unfair to him, giving plaudits to Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and Kaganovich. Taking everything into account, I firmly supported Khrushchev in his arguments with Kaganovich and Molotov. In 1957, while Khrushchev was away, someone in the Presidium, either Futseva or Kirichenko, raised the question of conferring on Khrushchev a second Hero of Socialist Labour Medal for major achievements in the agricultural sector. Serious arguments ignited, and it finally dawned on me how deep and impassable was the chasm between Molotov, Kaganovich, and Khrushchev. Molotov and Kaganovich believed there hadn't been any special achievements in agriculture or any personal achievements by Khrushchev in this regard. Malenkov supported them, claiming that Khrushchev was conducting an incorrect policy in agriculture, ignoring the Presidium, and at regional agricultural meetings, he was promoting the unrealistic slogan to catch up and overtake America in 2-3 years without prior agreement. Molotov criticized this as a reckless venture, insisting that Khrushchev should be called to order. However, the majority decided to award Khrushchev the second gold medal of Hero of Socialist Labour. While in Gorky, Khrushchev made a statement regarding the desirability of handing over to the state the bonds of all loans, some 260 billion rubles, in old money. Khrushchev was criticized again for discussing an important issue without prior ratification by the Presidium. Upon his return to Moscow, there was another unpleasant discussion, and it was decided to defer honouring the bonds for 25 years, rather than having them handed over to the state. Considering the necessity of decentralizing industrial administration and delegating more power to the Soviet republics, Khrushchev proposed to the Presidium the liquidation of many industrial ministries. Kaganovich rejected this proposal as premature and poorly thought out. Molotov supported Kaganovich, asserting that there should be general direction from Moscow, possibly with ministries being replaced by industrial committees. In the end, the majority of Presidium members supported Khrushchev's idea. At first, Bulganin meekly supported all of Khrushchev's initiatives, but gradually leaned more towards Molotov and Kaganovich. Bulganin's knowledge of the country's economics, especially in agriculture, was lacking, and he did not once present to the Presidium any issues from the Council of Ministers. He realized that he was failing in his role as chairman of the Council of Ministers, as Khrushchev was outperforming him in every aspect. It seems that privately he was fully prepared to join the anti-Khrushchev group, which he did as soon as he learned that the majority of Presidium members were against Khrushchev. In the spring of 1957, Khrushchev's son Sergei got married. To mark the occasion, there was a celebration at Khrushchev's dacha. As is customary at weddings, everybody drank heavily and made speeches. Khrushchev made a speech, as usual, speaking very well about his genealogy and warmly about his mother, who, in his words, loved to talk a lot. He then made a passing jab at Bulganin. On another occasion, Bulganin would have kept quiet, but this time he uncharacteristically flew into a rage and asked Khrushchev to be careful with his words. We knew that Bulganin was embittered against Khrushchev, and this understanding was confirmed. As soon as dinner was over, Molotov, Malenkov, Kaganovich, and Bulganin pointedly left the wedding and went to Malenkov's dacha. Khrushchev now realized that Bulganin had switched camps, and he was clearly worried about the strengthening of his opponent's group. After Bulganin, Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich left, Kirichenko walked up to me and started a conversation. "Georgy Konstantinovich, you do understand where all this is going, don't you? That group left the wedding the way they did for a reason. I think we have to keep our ears pricked and be ready for anything that might happen. We place our hopes in you. To the army, you are a great authority. One word from you, and the army will do what is necessary." I saw that Kirichenko was drunk, but I immediately became on guard. "What are you talking about, Alexei Illarionovich? I do not understand you. Where are you going with your words? Why are you talking about my authority in the army, and about me saying only one word? and it would do everything that's required. Kirichenko replied, "Have you not seen how maliciously they were talking to Khrushchev? Bulganin, Molotov, Kaganovich, and Malenkov are determined and bitter men. I think this business could get serious." It seemed to me that Kirichenko had not started this talk by accident and was not speaking just for himself. This suspicion was confirmed immediately by his next words. "In any event, we won't allow Nikita Sergeyevich to get hurt." I had always had a poor opinion of Kirichenko, considering him an Odessaite in the worst sense of the word. Here is an example of his character as an unprincipled communist. In 1946, I came to Odessa to head the military district, where Kirichenko was the first secretary of the regional party committee. After a couple of weeks, Kirichenko called me from the Odessa party HQ. "Listen, Georgy Konstantinovich, things are not great with my car, and the military district has many good trophy cars. I ask you please give me 1 or 2 cars." I replied that there was a car for him in the district, but its transfer had to be done through the Ministry of Defense. "You hand over the cars," said Kirichenko, "and don't worry about the documentation. In Odessa we can make any kind of document. We need." I had to put an end to this kind of lawlessness and sent an appropriate message to Moscow. Kirichenko got his cars, but then he began to treat me with disdain and was quite embittered. As the group had a majority, Khrushchev silently vacated the chair, and Bulganin took his place. Bulganin said, "Malenkov has the floor." Malenkov detailed all the issues with Khrushchev and proposed that he be relieved of his duties as first secretary of the party. Kaganovich spoke after Malenkov. His speech was clearly malicious. He said, "How can he be the first secretary? In the past he was a Trotskyist and he fought against Lenin. Politically he is badly educated. He meddled in agriculture, and he doesn't understand the field of industry, bringing confusion to its organization." Accusing him of vanity, Kaganovich proposed the acceptance of Malenkov's proposition to relieve Khrushchev of his duties as first secretary and give him other work. Molotov joined Malenkov and Kaganovich in proposing that instead of a first secretary, there should be a secretary for general matters, so that the personality cult would not be revived. Bulganin, Voroshilov, Pervukin, and Shepilov also associated themselves with these proposals. The matter had taken a serious turn. The Molotov-Malenkov group had a majority and could that day remove Khrushchev as first secretary. Against the decision to remove Khrushchev was a group consisting of Mikoyan, Suslov, Zhukov, Futseva, and Shvernik, but they were in a minority. Comrades Aristov, Kirichenko, and Saburov were not in Moscow. To gain time to call in absent members and to take other measures, we proposed that, in view of the importance of the issue, there should be a break until tomorrow while an urgent call was made to all members of the Presidium. We hoped that with the arrival of the absentees, the balance of power would be to our benefit. But Saburov went over to the other side and, upon arriving in Moscow, made a speech against Khrushchev. Seeing that the matter had taken a serious turn, Khrushchev proposed the urgent convening of a plenum of the Central Committee. The group rejected this suggestion, indicating that first Khrushchev had to go, and then we could convene the plenum. I saw that the only way out was decisive action. I announced, "I categorically insist on the urgent calling of a CC plenum. The issue is far bigger than that proposed by the group. At the plenum, I want to raise the question of Molotov, Kaganovich, Voroshilov, and Malenkov. I have in my hands materials about their bloody evil deeds, theirs and Stalin's, in 1937-38, and there is no place for them on the Presidium or even the Central Committee. If today the anti-party group decides to dismiss Khrushchev from the post of First Secretary, I will not submit to this decision, and I will appeal immediately to the party through party organizations in the armed forces." It was an unusual but necessary statement. To be frank, I wanted to deliver a firm psychological attack on the anti-party group and gain some time until the arrival of CC members, who were already being brought to Moscow by military aircraft. After my statement, it was decided to postpone the Presidium session meeting for 3 days, and this meant the Malenkov-Molotov group had lost their undertaking against Khrushchev. But I must point out that even though I was thanked for making such a decisive speech against the anti-party group, 4 months later, in October 1957, I was very sorry about my decisive statement in favour of Khrushchev because it was turned against me personally, on which I will elaborate. The reconvened Presidium meeting lasted for 3 days, from morning till night. During the breaks between sessions, the two sides prepared themselves for the next day's clashes, and this is worth describing briefly. The Malenkov-Molotov group most often conducted their conversations in subgroups of 2 or 3 people, and only once did the whole group gather in Bulganin's office. By the end of the second day, it was noticeable that their members' determination was diminishing, while the activism and energy of Khrushchev's side grew, and its counter-accusations became more threatening. In the middle of day 2, a group of 10 CC members arrived and demanded that the Presidium listen to them, as they were very worried about the unity of the Presidium. This group had earlier been informed about the situation in the Presidium. Right till the end of the session, the Malenkov-Molotov group was not willing to listen to this group of CC members, but then, under pressure from the supporters of Khrushchev, it was decided to send Voroshilov, Bulganin, Khrushchev and Shvernik to negotiate with them. The meeting was held in the Presidium's lobby, and the CC members demanded the convening of a plenum. The Presidium members, who had sided with Khrushchev from the very first day, acted energetically to keep the organizational and ideological initiative in their hands. To ensure unity of action, we met in the evenings in the CC building to discuss the next day. On the first day, it was decided to gather the CC members urgently in Moscow in order to conduct a CC plenum. We thought that the plenum would condemn the action of the Malenkov-Molotov group and would support Khrushchev. To gather the CC members quickly, it was decided to bring them from the provinces to Moscow by Air Force planes. The organization of this was delegated to the Ministry of Defense. Besides that, I took upon myself the responsibility to talk personally to Voroshilov in order to separate him from the Malenkov-Molotov group. I undertook this negotiation because we were to some extent related, though we had never met. His grandson was married to my daughter at that time. Nothing came of the negotiations. Voroshilov was on the side of the Malenkov-Molotov group and against Khrushchev. On the first and second days, Khrushchev was somewhat demoralized and appeared perplexed. Seeing that I resolutely stood for his defense, and that many members of the Presidium and the CC were immediately drawn to me as if I was the central figure in the situation, Khrushchev said with emotion, "Georgy, save the day, you can do it. I will never forget you." I calmed him down and said, "Nikita, be firm and calm. We will be supported by the plenum, and if the Malenkov-Molotov group venture to employ violence, we will be ready for it." Khrushchev replied, "Do everything that you deem necessary in the interests of the party, the CC and the Presidium." On the second day of the Presidium, Saburov, having got wind of something, spoke sharply against Khrushchev and said, "What are you up to, Khrushchev? Have you decided to arrest us because we are speaking out against you personally?" Khrushchev asked, "Where are you getting this from?" Saburov replied, "From the fact that tanks have appeared around Moscow." I said, "What tanks? What are you babbling about, Comrade Saburov? Tanks cannot come to Moscow without the minister's order, and there has been no such order on my part." This counterattack of mine was appreciated very much by the Khrushchev group, and Khrushchev very often quoted it at plenums and in other speeches. But after a while, this counterattack was interpreted quite differently. A different political complexion was put on it, and it was elevated to a Bonapartist policy. For Khrushchev and other members of the Presidium, the formation of such a large group opposed to him was surprising. We knew, of course, that Kaganovich, Molotov and Voroshilov were his opponents, but for Saburov, Shepilov and Pavukin to rise up against Khrushchev was completely unexpected. On the second day of the Presidium meeting, Brezhnev became ill and only came to the CC plenum when the situation had been fully clarified and resolved. Mikoyan, Suslov, Shvernik, Futseva, Aristov, I and Kirichenko stood firmly at Khrushchev's side. During the third day of the Presidium, we decided to miss the evening meeting and to go straight to the plenum, which had already gathered in the Sverdlov Hall. I don't know what the Malenkov-Molotov group were hoping, but they thought the plenum would support them. It seems they had supporters among the CC members, but they didn't reveal themselves at the plenum. Khrushchev's supporters feared the Molotov-Malenkov group would venture to arrest us, and there were some grounds to suspect this. For example, the number of security officers looking after Bulganin, Molotov, Malenkov and Kaganovich rose sharply on the first day, raising the question, what was this for? Bulganin and Malenkov had many friends in the KGB and the MVD, and among MVD troops, if necessary, the group could resort to their help. Having gained the firm support and reassurances of CC members arriving in Moscow that they wanted to seriously sort out the Malenkov-Molotov group, Khrushchev felt a surge of energy and returned to his old self, the optimist. He was not mistaken. The plenum supported him unanimously. The June plenum of the CC harshly accused the Malenkov-Molotov group of anti-party actions. I won't quote the plenum memorandum, which is common knowledge. But it has to be said that while the Presidium's subject matter was Khrushchev's activities and his removal from the post of First Secretary at the plenum, the issues were much broader, and the Malenkov-Molotov group faced serious charges regarding issues of principle, including the documented role of Molotov, Kaganovich and Voroshilov, together with Stalin, in the destruction of many honest party, military and Soviet figures. How did those opposed to Khrushchev behave? From the first hours of the plenum, confusion and disorder reigned in the anti-party group. Pavukin, Saburov and Shepilov began to confess their errors and beg for their repentance to be taken into account. Bulganin was at a loss, running like a cowardly hare, coming up with all sorts of unintelligible excuses. He looked very unauthoritative. Molotov and Malenkov held firm and defended their beliefs to the end. As ever, Kaganovich was very talkative, but his verbosity was badly received by the members of the CC. At first, Voroshilov sided with Molotov but then lost it and began to make excuses, saying that he hadn't realized the true aims and intentions of the Molotov-Malenkov group. This said it all about Voroshilov and how he had behaved under Stalin too. After the plenum, a new presidium was elected. I was elected a full member of the presidium, and the work gradually came to its normal flow. In September 1957, Khrushchev, Mikoyan, Brezhnev, Kirichenko and I went for a holiday in the Crimea. The Black Sea weather was beneficial for a good rest. We often met at Khrushchev's place, spending the time leisurely and productively, often discussing general political issues and the practical affairs of our motherland. I was preparing for my visit to Yugoslavia and Albania, where I had been invited by Josip Broz Tito and Enver Hoxha. My holiday in the Crimea was nearing its end when a very unpleasant circumstance arose for me. While walking with Brezhnev and Khrushchev around the grounds of Khrushchev's dacha, the following conversation took place. Brezhnev: Nikita Sergeyevich, Kadar phoned me from Budapest and asked that General Kazakov, whom Comrade Zhukov is planning to transfer to the Far East, remain as the commander of the Soviet troops in Hungary. The Hungarian comrades have gotten used to Kazakov, and I think we should take into account Kadar's opinion. Marshal Zhukov will find another commander for the Far East. I said, in the interests of the defence of the country, General Kazakov should be sent to command the Far East district, and for Hungary we will find another good commander. Brezhnev, anxiously: one has to consider Kadar's opinion. I replied, one has to consider my opinion too. Don't get worked up. I am as much a member of the Presidium as you are, Comrade Brezhnev. Khrushchev kept silent, but I understood that he was not happy with my sharp reply. A couple of minutes later, Brezhnev, taking Khrushchev by the arm, walked with him to the side and started to convince him ardently about something. I guessed that they were talking about me. After the talk with Khrushchev, Brezhnev left for his dacha without even saying goodbye to me. After this first tiff, another, more significant one happened. A couple of days later, we were all invited to Kirilenko's dacha on the occasion of his wife's birthday. During the dinner, there were speeches and toasts and more speeches. Prevalent in the speeches was all-round praise for Khrushchev. All this praise he took as his due, and, being in high spirits, he was interrupting speakers and taking somebody else's turn to make more speeches. I didn't like it, and straight as I am, said, "Nikita Sergeyevich, according to the agreed schedule, the next speech is by Aristov." Khrushchev said aggrievedly, "Well, I can stop speaking altogether if you are not willing to listen to me." After that, Khrushchev's spirits dampened, and he stayed silent. I tried to make light of it, but in vain. It was immediately picked up for use by sycophants and whisperers, and I and Khrushchev parted very coldly. I have to say that later I kicked myself for having opened my mouth, knowing that Khrushchev, being resentful, didn't forgive anybody who attacked him personally. I didn't manage to meet with Khrushchev before going to Yugoslavia. Having talked to him on the phone, I left for Moscow and was getting ready to go to Belgrade in a couple of days. On the eve of my flight, I rang the Crimea to report that I was departing for Yugoslavia the next day, but was told that Khrushchev and a group of the Presidium members had flown to Kiev, where the Commander-in-Chief of our ground forces, Malinovsky, was conducting a meeting with the higher command of our ground forces. At this gathering, the commander of the Kiev district, Chuikov, demonstrated the crossing of a water obstacle by tanks. I was informed that Brezhnev, Kirichenko, Kirilenko, Aristov, and Mukhitinov had gone with Khrushchev to the meeting in Kiev. I phoned Kiev on the Vich, and Chuikov answered the phone. Having reported on the progress of the meeting, he told me, "You need to be at this meeting yourself. There's some important business going on here." I told Chuikov, "In accordance with the leadership's decision, I have to leave for Yugoslavia tomorrow morning, and I hope that everything will be well, Vasily Ivanovich." Chuikov continued, "It will be so, Comrade Marshal, but it would be better if you were here yourself." Intuitively, I felt that Chuikov had said that for a reason. I asked for Khrushchev to come to the phone. With Khrushchev I had a good talk. I said to him, "Should I delay my trip to Yugoslavia for 3 days and come to Kiev for the meeting, as they say there are a lot of interesting issues coming up?" Khrushchev, "It is not necessary to postpone your trip to Yugoslavia. I think we will handle it ourselves somehow, and when you return from Yugoslavia, I will tell you all that was interesting here." Calmed down by such a friendly talk, the next morning I flew to Sevastopol with a group of generals and officers, where we left on the cruiser Kutuzov through the Bosporus Strait for Yugoslavia. We arrived at the Bosporus Strait the next morning. I hadn't been there before, and I looked with great interest at what was, from an operational point of view, an important strait, one connecting the Black and Mediterranean seas. Early in the morning, a motorboat with American officers demonstratively came up to the cruiser and photographed the Kutuzov from every angle. Apart from the American military on the strait's banks, there was not one Turkish soul. It was the same all along the Bosporus Strait. There were many Greek islands scattered in the Mediterranean, and the coastline of the Greek territory looked bare, gloomy, and poor. After skirting the Greek and Albanian islands, we came into the waters of the Adriatic. Italy could be seen in the distance. Approaching port, the Yugoslavian comrades met us in their ships. At the port, we were ceremonially met by a guard of honour, and there were many Yugoslavians present. In Belgrade, we had a meeting with Marshal Tito, Rankovic, Kardelj, Popovic, the State Secretary of Defence, and many others. After a couple of days, Comrade Tito invited us to the mountains to hunt wild goats. I was very lucky at the hunt. I killed 4 goats. Tito killed only 1, and it seemed to me he was dissatisfied with his results, but he had shot at least 6 times. After the hunt, we were able to go to Croatia, Serbia, Dalmatia, and other places. Everywhere and always we were met with wild delight and joy towards the Soviet people, who had done so much to liberate the Yugoslavian people from German fascist occupation. We conducted many talks with military, party, and state officials, with workers, and with the intelligentsia. I was touched by the love and sympathy that they expressed towards the Soviet Union. Before the flight to Albania, I sent Khrushchev a coded telegram, in which I said that the Yugoslavian people and government regarded the Soviet Union with great sympathy, and that it seemed that when our people visited the country before, they were biased in highlighting the unfriendliness of the Yugoslavian leadership. I proposed a rethinking of our mutual relations in favour of their improvement. It appeared that in the Presidium my suggestion was read as though I was trying to dictate my own line, one that did not correspond to the Marxist-Leninist line of the CC on the Yugoslavian question. However, within a few years of Khrushchev's visit to Yugoslavia in 1955, it was regarded as a socialist country and undoubtedly friendly to our people. But in 1957, when I returned to Moscow, I was scolded for this opinion, even though nothing had changed in Yugoslavia during these past years. From Yugoslavia, we took a Tu-104 flight to Albania, where we were met very cordially by the Albanians, their army, and the ruling party. In Albania, I received information that the Presidium had called a meeting of party activists in the armed forces, but that until I returned to Moscow, I couldn't be told what questions were being discussed, at this meeting attended by the leaders of the army and the navy, as well as all the members of the Presidium. Naturally, I couldn't but be alerted and worried about the fact that for some reason these activists had been gathered in my absence. I asked to talk to my first deputy Konev, but he replied through the secretariat along the same lines. The atmosphere had soured. 2 days later, we flew from Albania back to Moscow. We landed in Vnukovo, and it was with great apprehension that I walked through the doors of the party's Central Committee building, where the members of the Presidium had gathered. They had gathered to debate the decisions I had made regarding my visit to Yugoslavia and Albania. The first to speak was Brezhnev, who gave a brief speech and said that, as far as the Western press and many comrades from the army and the navy were concerned, I should have waited for the situation in the Balkans to settle down before I visited these countries, given the tense atmosphere existing in the region at that time. Brezhnev's words took me by surprise. I took the floor after Brezhnev, who turned out to be the very first who was bringing up all these criticisms. At first, I told the members of the Presidium that the mood of the people in both Yugoslavia and Albania was supportive and sympathetic towards the Soviet Union, and that it would be a crime not to take advantage of that mood. The atmosphere in the meeting gradually began to warm up, and I went on to say that I hadn't been convinced that our comrades, who had been sent to these countries and were working there, had expressed that opinion. When I finished, all the members of the Presidium started to defend my position, noting that my opinions were indeed the opinions of the comrades working there. The meeting went well, but my relationship with Khrushchev was strained for a long time after that. I continued. Before my leaving for Yugoslavia and Albania, the Presidium didn't have any issues with me, and all of a sudden there are plenty of them. What's the matter? I don't understand why it had been decided to deal with me in such a way. Khrushchev replied coldly. When you come to the plenum, you will find out. I said, I think our previous friendly relations give me the right to ask you personally about the reasons for such an unfriendly attitude towards me. Khrushchev. Don't get excited. We will still work with you. This was essentially the end of our talk. I hadn't learned anything from Khrushchev, but realized that my fate was in his hands and the prospects were hazy. At the plenum, the first to speak were Suslov, Brezhnev, Kirichenko, Furtseva, and Mikoyan. Their speeches were a bit mealy-mouthed, but I knew it was heading towards getting rid of me, towards removing me from the Central Committee. Brezhnev and Mikoyan said that I was ignoring Khrushchev as the first secretary of the CC. To show this, they relied on 2 facts. The first fact, in the summer of 1957, Khrushchev visited the German Democratic Republic at the invitation of the CC of the SED, Socialist Unity Party. On the eve of Khrushchev's arrival in Berlin, I was phoned by Rokossovsky, who was inspecting the military preparedness of Soviet troops in the GDR. Rokossovsky said, Tomorrow Khrushchev arrives in Berlin, but the troops are in the field, and the exercise will not be over for a couple of days. What should we do with Grechko? I said, Tomorrow Khrushchev arrives in Berlin at the invitation of the CC of the SED. You have to go through with the exercise that has started. When it has finished, you and Grechko will introduce yourselves to Comrade Khrushchev. When Khrushchev arrived in Berlin, there was no welcome from Grechko, the commander of the Soviet forces in Germany, from Marshal Rokossovsky, or from a guard of honor of our troops. The second fact: that summer, Khrushchev visited Estonia and was going to go by car to Leningrad. From Leningrad, the commander of the Leningrad region, General Zakharov, called me and said that the Leningrad authorities were going to meet Khrushchev at the Estonian border and asked if he should join them. I instructed Zakharov to meet Khrushchev in Leningrad. General Zakharov reported to Khrushchev that I had forbidden him to meet him at the Estonian border together with the regional leadership. It seems that these two incidents seriously hurt the pride and ever-growing vanity of Khrushchev. He didn't say anything to me at the time, but apparently vented his resentment in front of Brezhnev and Mikoyan. I thought, and still do, that I was acting correctly, because the regulations of the Soviet Army do not provide for a special reception for the secretary of the CC of the CPSU. Everybody should be equal before the law. I thought that nobody had the right to revive the personality cult and, even more so, to cultivate idolatry. Hardly any party or Soviet leaders spoke at the plenum, but to the fore was a united front of the majority of the marshals who were Minister of Defense deputies under me, including Zheltov, the head of the main political administration. It was evident that they had been primed in advance to belittle and decry my work, especially Malinovsky, Sokolovsky, Yeremenko, Biruzov, Konev, and Gorshkov. After their speeches, the deal that had been done was apparent. The speeches came down to the allegation that I had ignored party political work in the army, that I was trying to break the army from the CC, etc. But that was just a smokescreen. The real aim was to get rid of me immediately, so that I wouldn't be standing in the way of those seeking glory by any means, and who weren't willing to share it with anybody else. It was clear, too, that it had been resolved to strike me mainly with blows by the military, who had been prepped beforehand and outdid themselves discrediting my work, belittling in every way my service during the Great Patriotic War with utter absurdities and falsifications. Even Khrushchev had to correct Marshal Yeremenko, who in the heat of his loud, sycophantic speech said, "What about this Zhukov? They say he personally led the Battle of Stalingrad, but he wasn't even there." Khrushchev: "Well, Andrei Ivanovich, you shouldn't chatter so. We knew Zhukov very well as a commander. If some commanders were not successful at the front, Zhukov was always successful." At the plenum, a picture by the artist Yakovlev, who had been dead quite a while, was displayed. I had learned about the existence of this picture only 2 months before the plenum. At some stage, Zheltov came to me and said that he had this picture by Yakovlev, which nicely depicted me against the background of vanquished Berlin. I asked to be shown the picture. Personally, I liked the painting, not because it depicted me on a rearing horse, but because I felt the artist's love for the Soviet army, which has defeated the blackest stronghold of imperialism fascist Germany. Zheltov asked me what to do with the painting. I replied, "Give it to the Soviet Army Museum. Maybe it will come in handy." It seemed to me that the matter of the painting was now closed. But when the case was fabricated against me, Zheltov reported to the CC about this painting in a warped way, saying that I instructed him to hang the painting in the Soviet Army Officers' Hall. In order to defame and ridicule me, the painting was displayed at the plenum for everybody to see, and then it was driven around to party activists' meetings in Moscow. The demonstration of the painting was accompanied by derogatory comments such as, "Look how Zhukov portrays himself as George the Conqueror." Those who didn't cover themselves in glory during the Great Patriotic War were especially concerned to paint me this way. Khrushchev was the last to speak at the plenum. He said, "When Bulganin and I were in the Far East after visiting the troops, we were invited to dinner by Marshal Malinovsky. At the dinner, Malinovsky said, 'Beware of Zhukov, he is a budding Napoleon. If needed, he won't stop at anything.'" I didn't pay much attention to Malinovsky's words then, but I was later reminded of those words and their meaning by Bulganin. It just goes to show how long Malinovsky was engaged in provocation and intrigue against me, but I did not suspect it. It seemed strange to me that such a statement by Malinovsky, made to Khrushchev in 1955, was the same one used by Beria to frighten Stalin in 1945. The question arises, did this provocative statement come from the same source? It would not be surprising if Malinowski, who made such a provocative statement in 1955, had done the same in 1945. During the plenum, I came to realize that the question about me had already been resolved at the Presidium. Therefore, I didn't deem it necessary to exonerate myself, knowing that nothing would come of this. I reported to the plenum that the armed forces were in a state of full readiness. In cutting the personnel of the political officers, I was trying, above all, to raise the role and activity of party organizations, to improve the role of unitary commanders, and to cut expenditure on paid political organs. It was not clear why the question about me was raised so sharply. If I had made mistakes, I could correct them. Why were such harsh methods needed? What was talked about had, to a degree, taken place, but the facts were given a tendentious political spin. At the plenum, I was removed from the Presidium and from membership of the CC. The plenum resolution about me was announced a week later, deliberately timed to coincide with the report of the first rocket to go into orbit round the Earth. In my presence, the CC plenum only took a decision on the organizational issue, that is, my removal from membership of the Central Committee. It was contrary to the usual procedure that the political resolution wasn't discussed and decided in my presence, and I was denied the possibility of defending myself from the stated accusations. I absolutely cannot agree with the resolution passed, as it did not correspond to reality and was patently tendentious, aiming to blacken me before the people and the party. The worst thing was that, as during the period of the personality cult, I was, without proof, being stuck with all kinds of anti-party labels, blamed without any evidence for trying to tear the armed forces away from the party and from the people. I think this resolution cannot withstand critique. The question arises, how is it possible to separate from the people and the party an army of millions consisting of more than 90% communists and Komsomol members, an army with a yearly draft of 1 million young people into its ranks who are discharged when they finish their term, an army in daily contact with the multifaceted life of the party and the people? I am sure that neither the people nor the party believed such strange charges. Simultaneous with the announcement of the plenum resolution, there was an article about me in the press written by Marshal Konev, which was full of lazy lies and libelous attacks. Konev amazed me with his lack of principles. As is well known, Konev was my first deputy. For at least 3 months each year, he acted as Minister of Defence, very often carrying out the basic tasks of the ministry and communicating daily with the CC and the government. I do not know of any instance when, on issues of principle, his view differed from mine. He often boasted that during many years of joint work, we had worked out a common point of view on all the basic issues concerning the building and training of the armed forces. As he was an old political officer, I valued and listened to his advice on issues of personnel education and on practical questions of party political work. Konev often reassured me of his devoted friendship. Imagine my surprise, then, when Konev announced at the plenum that he had never been my friend, that he had always thought that I underestimated his work, that I ignored him, and that he didn't agree with me on a multitude of questions, but was afraid to place these disagreements in front of the Presidium, thinking that Zhukov had the agreement of the Presidium. 6 months after the plenum, I accidentally bumped into Konev in Granovsky Street. I did not want to meet and talk to him, but he noticed me, stopped at his car, and waited for me. Between us, the conversation went, Konev: "Good day. Why haven't you visited? You broke away completely from us, forgot your old friends." Returning the greeting, I said, "Ivan Stepanovich, what friends are you talking about? If you mean yourself, then it was you who announced at the plenum that you never had been Zhukov's friend." Konev: "Of course you don't know everything that happened before the plenum, when the matter was very serious. Come in, we'll talk." I replied to him, "Why, Ivan Stepanovich, did you get frightened and disown our friendship? I really don't understand you. You are a Marshal of the Soviet Union, a member of the Central Committee. You knew that everything said about me was false, fabricated with a definite aim in mind. How come you did not object to this undertaking? As for your invitation to come to the Ministry of Defence, I think I have no business there." Since pedestrians, recognizing us, had begun stopping, we said our goodbyes. Konev got into the car, and I went by foot, wanting to clear my head after such an unpleasant talk. After the exclusion of the Molotov-Malenkov group from the Presidium, Kirichenko, Aristov, Ignatov, Furtseva and Pospelov were removed from membership. Among the old guard, only Mikoyan stayed on the Presidium. Well, he is an old diplomat. Nobody can navigate a situation and adapt to it like Mikoyan. The CC plenum motion spoke about giving me a different post, but this resolution wasn't executed, and I, quite able-bodied, was dismissed from the armed forces. For a long time after my dismissal, my activities were portrayed in a distorted light in the pages of the press, in speeches, in lectures, etc., attributing to me a series of negative events that never happened. But I can say a big thank you to the party and the people because of the regard for me of the majority of Soviet people and communists.